Welcome back to Israel Matters, everyone. Once again, I'm Rabbi Wolicki, and I'm here with my dear friend, Elliot Chodoff. How you doing, Elliot?
I'm good. How are you, Pesach?
Good. I had a very busy weekend.
I understand. Mazal tov.
Thank you very much. It was my son's bar mitzvah this Shabbat, my son Asaf. He's the seventh of my 8 children. Yes, I know, 8 kids, a lot of kids. But he's the last bar mitzvah. The next one is a daughter. And it was just a very busy, hectic time. We didn't do a big party because of coronavirus, but there was still a lot going on. I just wanted to share a quick thought from something that I thought about last night. After Shabbat was over, right at the end of Shabbat, we have a custom, a Jewish practice that every month in the first 2 weeks, sometime within the first 2 weeks after the new moon, we go outside, usually after Shabbat on a Saturday night, and we look at the moon and we say certain prayers after looking at the moon, kind of prayers over the moon. We're not praying to the moon, even though it kind of looks like that standing outside. But we say these prayers, and the prayers are really about the renewal and the constant rebirth of the Jewish people. And the Jewish people have always seen the moon as a metaphor for our own existence, where it kind of shrinks down and almost disappears and then rises again and brings light into the world. But I wanted to share one little thought I had as I was saying these prayers, Kiddush Levana, about the fact that the moon is seen as symbolic of the people of Israel and has been for thousands of years. And that is that we know now, and this wasn't necessarily known in ancient times, but we know now that the moon is only reflecting the light of the sun. It doesn't have its own light, and that wasn't necessarily known by people in the ancient world. But knowing that, I think it gives a deeper understanding to the moon as a metaphor for the people of Israel, in that God is the source of light. And our job, if we're the moon, is to reflect that light into the world. So the light that we are shining in the world as a light unto the nations is really God's light that we're reflecting. And that helps to understand a verse in Isaiah. And with this I'll end. Isaiah chapter 30, verse 26, there's a verse that it's in one of these prophecies about the end times, about the future. And we believe that we're living in that future now. And the verse says as follows: "At that time, the light of the moon will be like the light of the sun, and the light of the sun will be sevenfold." Now, obviously, this is not meant to be taken literally. If the moon was as bright as the sun, that would mean that it would be as bright as nighttime as it is during the day. And then it would mean that if the sun was even brighter, it's not really a world that we could live in. What it really means, I think, if we think about this symbol, is that we'll have the ability to reflect so much of God's light in the world that it won't just be a kind of little light in a dark sky, but we'll actually be able to illuminate the world. And it really speaks to our mission. I just thought that was a nice way to start thinking about a lot of the stuff that's going on in the world today, and how the nation of Israel, with all the bad things going on, is really just getting stronger and more stable. And thank God we're living in such glorious times. But we still have our problems, as we talk about here. Elliot, last time you took us back to the year 2000 and to how things unfolded in the security zone, buffer zone, whatever you want to call it, that in South Lebanon, and with the Israeli pullout there and the implications of that. There have been some skirmishes this week, little things, little firecrackers going on along the southern border. Maybe you could take us into those
the northern border as well.
On the northern border, yeah. I mean, again, with Hizbollah. Sorry, I meant on the northern border. And maybe you could take us into what has happened this week, and use that to bring us back into our story.
Well, a couple of things have been reported. There was one major event where some Hezbollah fighters opened fire on an Israeli position, and we responded with basically an all-night barrage, mainly of flares, but also some artillery striking at some of their positions, essentially sending them a subtle but clear message that that kind of behavior is unacceptable.
Okay, so where does a flare-up like that rank in terms of how close that is to things turning into something bigger? Meaning, because there's stuff like this. The reason I ask is that we know that if we pay close attention, there's little skirmishes all the time.
All the time, yes.
And what is this? Is this something that's out of the ordinary that was more, or is this the kind of thing that happens every couple of weeks or every couple of months that we should be?
This is unusual. The last, I would say, decade or so has been very quiet along the border. There were a couple of blip incidents after we took out a Hezbollah leader in Lebanon a few years ago, but primarily it's been quiet. And they've been very careful, scrupulous about keeping it quiet. And in the past few months, it has picked up, not enormously, but significantly compared to the quiet that there was. And
so what's the purpose there? What's the strategic motive for kind of turning the burner a little higher, but not escalating too far? Like, what do they want from that?
So first of all, let me go back one step to your question. How close are we to an eruption? And the answer is you never know, because there's always the possibility of what I call the nursery school scenario, but there are all sorts of variants on it. And by the way, it can work in both directions. In other words, they could fire something into our side and inadvertently kill a bunch of kids. We could fire into their side and inadvertently kill a bunch of kids. And in either case, we could suddenly have an eruption that neither side wanted to have happen on that particular day.
But the response must be taken, and
exactly,
therefore
and back
you
and
have an
forth.
escalation.
Okay, so anytime they're shooting, there's always the chance of an escalation. Even if you say the probability is low, it's greater than 0. Now, the why, let's go back. There are certain parallels to what we were talking about last time, and I want to elaborate on them, because the period we were talking about was the aftermath of the pullout in 2000, and it's a period that historically is kind of bracketed with the 2000 pullout from Lebanon and the 2006 war with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Okay,
and that'll help us understand what's going on now.
Exactly, because we're in a place today that is similar somewhat to that period of the end of 05 into 06, where the war broke out over the summer. It's not exactly the same, but there are certain important parallels. So let's just go back briefly. 2000, Israel pulls out. We make it clear we're not going to tolerate anything from them. And within a few months, the war breaks out with the Palestinians, the Palestinian terrorist assault. That's commonly referred to as the Second Intifada, which was not an intifada, it was a terrorist war, marked by the suicide attacks of late 01 and into 02. We'll talk about that another time in detail, and basically hits its kind of culminating point with the Passover Seder attack in Netanya at the Park Hotel, and then we launch an attack.
I'll just point out that my parents, who live in Netanya, heard the explosion from their living room.
I'm sure. And then we launched our offensive, and things changed. But in any event, that's the period we're talking about. And since that broke out shortly after the withdrawal from Lebanon, we shifted, that is, the IDF shifted its infantry forces into Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, because that's where the attacks were coming from. And the forces that were moved up to the northern border were combat troops, but not infantry. In other words, people whose trained job is not to hold territory and defend territory in that fashion. Tank units without the tanks, engineer units, very good soldiers, but just it's not what they were trained to do for a living. And in the course of the next 5-6 years, a number of attacks, one notorious one already in the fall of 2000, near Shaba Farms, Mount Dove, where stuff is still going on today. The 3 soldiers who were killed and whose bodies were taken, but they were considered alive, but even though we kind of knew that they weren't. But we didn't respond. Very, very minor response. And in the course of those years, about 24 Israelis were killed by Hezbollah. There was a lot of fire across the border, and we essentially ignored it. And here, I want to make clear, it was a decision that I disagreed with, and I think I mentioned last time, I actually wrote an article about it called Ignoring the North. It wasn't a stupid decision. I make a distinction between decisions I don't agree with and stupid decisions. It was a reasonable decision. All the action is in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. It's much closer to the population centers. That's where the focus needs to be. That was the way of thinking. And the North, well, look, we're out of the way. Hezbollah is just being a slight irritant.
And they're trying to draw us into a conflict. They're trying
Exactly.
to blow things up. So we're not gonna give them the satisfaction of responding.
Especially since we don't have the force to do it. And this is an important point, I think, that's missed in a lot of the analysis of that period. We just didn't have the force. We weren't in a position to simultaneously run long-term operations in Judea and Samaria, Gaza, and the northern border. Okay? Without calling up reserves and going into a full-scale war kind of an operation, but you can't do that long-term. In other words, anybody who's familiar with the Israeli military knows the reserves are the last ditch. You call up the reserves to fight and go home.
So that's why they were using soldiers
to augment the regular army.
So that's why the soldiers patrolling the northern border during this time period were not really fully trained for what they were doing, because it was kind of the third front.
Yeah, the appropriate troops.
Right.
Right. Okay, now, what changed things there was the withdrawal from Gaza in the summer of 2005. Because by the fall of 2005, we had already moved frontline infantry back up to the northern border. Okay, I don't want to go into the Gaza withdrawal here again. That's a whole story we can cover another time. I was very much involved in Gaza in those days, including in the withdrawal. But what's important to understand is that that withdrawal freed up a huge amount of infantry. And instead of engineer and tank units, now we had the Golani Infantry Brigade and the paratroops, the 35th Airborne Brigade, on the northern border. And all of a sudden, Hezbollah started taking it on the chin. I'm talking about in the fall of 2005 and into 2006. And they hadn't fully internalized that there was a change in what it had, in our policies. And they kept escalating, which ultimately led to the war in 2006. Now, we'll talk about the war in 2006 next time. I want to bring it back to where we are today. What's happening today is, again, there are parallels. I don't want to say exactly the same, but there are parallels. First of all, we don't want a war. We don't want an escalation. Why? Because we don't. That's who we are. We never want an escalation. If we can avoid it, we're going to avoid it. We're certainly not going to do it just for the heck of it. Hezbollah is caught on the horns of a dilemma, and I just wrote an article about this. Hopefully it'll be published the next week or two, and I'll give references when it comes out. But Hezbollah is caught on the horns of a dilemma. On the one hand, they don't want an escalation now either. On the other hand, they have declared that they will respond to Israeli aggression, and that includes the attacks that we're doing against their operations in Syria, meant to bolster their forces in Lebanon. Okay, it's a little confusing perhaps, but they're shipping weapons, the Iranians with Hezbollah are shipping weapons into Lebanon. We are interdicting those shipments in Syria. We're causing them damage. And about a month ago, we killed one of their operatives, not by intent. I mean, I don't know whether we knew he was there or not, but he wasn't the objective. He was a bonus. He was there when the shipment was hit, so he was hit. Yeah. And he got killed. Now, again, I don't know if we knew he was there, we knew we were going to kill him or not, but he wasn't the primary target of the attack. So that's what Nasrallah has been screaming about for the last few weeks, that he's going to take revenge. Exactly. Okay. Because Nasrallah has been saying on and off indirectly for years, and clearly since the beginning of this year, that they will respond heavily to any attacks against their interests or people in Lebanon or Syria. And now he's put himself out into an untenable position. Because deterrence, and here's the trap, we're deterring them and they're deterring us. But deterrence doesn't work well against someone who's trying to maintain the status quo. Deterrence works in order to maintain the status quo. So trying to stop us from preventing them from shipping arms into Lebanon is a very, very poor use of deterrence, and it's virtually doomed to fail, and it is failing. Now,
explain, why is that?
Okay.
Why is it?
Because deterrence as a strategy is, I don't want to go into all the theory, but deterrence as a strategy is basically meant to freeze a situation. Okay?
But we're not exactly freezing the situation. We're trying to prevent them from increasing their arms, and therefore we're taking aggressive action
against theirs.
And they don't want to be retaliating or attacking us in response. If they treat what we're doing as an offensive, then they have to escalate things. So
Correct.
Deterrence is a bad way to stop us from doing this.
Right.
Got it.
Okay.
Got it. That's very interesting.
But they're trying to apply it nonetheless. Now, they don't want to do it in a way that will lead to an escalation. Which is why a month ago they launched an attack against our outpost on Mount Dove, what they call Shaba Farms, which failed miserably. We, also not wanting to escalate it, did something which I thought was a mistake, but I understand the rationale behind it. Again, I can disagree and not consider it stupid. We opened fire on them. We saw them coming. We waited till they crossed the border. We opened fire on them at long range and chased them back. I personally, because I'm just that kind of guy, would have preferred to let them come in a lot closer and kill them. But there were other considerations. They denied that it happened. In other words, we gave them a huge out to deny all of it. In other words, no blood, no foul. In the interim, their position in Lebanon is being threatened because of the Beirut blast. And other things, but let's take the Beirut blast as a sort of...
Really, how is that playing out? What sort of implications is it having? Are they political, public implications?
Yes, there are a few of them. One, there are more and more indicators that Hezbollah was either indirectly or directly involved in the blast. And it doesn't matter for our purpose, it doesn't matter which. In other words, there was something Hezbollah related to it, whether they had control of the ammonium nitrate or they had weapons next to it or whatever. Their name is being associated more and more with it. And leaving for a moment responsibility in the grand sense, which is also hurting them, there's becoming a louder and louder call in Lebanon for them to remove their missiles and munitions and ordnance from populated areas in Lebanon, because it clearly endangers the population. Now, for them, hiding their stuff in civilian populated areas is integral to their strategy because it makes it much harder for us to strike it. So they're in a somewhat weaker position. Remember, the government resigned. This is not the end of Hezbollah. So
currently there is no government in Lebanon.
It's a caretaker.
Okay.
Okay, but let's just say in pure, simple relative terms, Hezbollah today is in a weaker position in Lebanon than it was a month ago, 6 weeks ago, whatever. One of the ways that they establish their importance is to show that they are on the front line of resistance against Israel. So having made the statement that he's going to retaliate for what we did in Syria, he has to do it. But he has to do it in such a way that doesn't lead to an escalation. So for example, in the first attack, he's got a problem. I said he's got a dilemma. Okay? In the attack on Har Dov, we chased them away. There was no backup. In other words, they didn't press the attack, they fled. In the announced attack last week, they opened fire. We did whatever we did firing back, and they fled. They didn't press the attack. In other words, they don't want it to become engagement, reinforce, engage, airstrike, tank strike, anti-tank, anti-air. What that means is two things. One is that we're likely to see them keep trying until they succeed.
What does
But
succeed
two, because
mean?
they're doing it on such a minimal level.
Does succeed mean that they get
They
lucky?
get lucky and they knock out a tank or they kill some soldiers or something.
Got it.
Okay, and they can declare victory. Or they, more likely, I mean, if they keep trying, eventually they may succeed. They're likely eventually to succeed. But in the meantime, because they're doing it on such a minimal level, the odds of success of any given one of those attacks are very, very low. Combination of our very good intelligence and the fact that they're not trying to use overwhelming concentration of force at a particular point, which would increase the chances of that specific attack working, means that we're likely to be seeing sort of repeated failures. Now, the reason I say that this is similar to what happened in 06 is because there was a series of repeated failures from the fall of 05 until the attack in July 06 that started the war. And each of those led to, not in a linear fashion, but in a sort of periodic fashion, led to a slight raise of the intensity of what they were doing until they reached the point in the July 06 attack where it was a massive attack. They came across the border with a whole bunch of guys. They took out 2 vehicles. They killed a bunch of soldiers. They blew up a tank that went after them when they grabbed the bodies. In other words, that wasn't their original plan. As a matter of fact, Nasrallah, after the war, said, if I had known that was going to be the Israeli response, I never would have done the thing in the first place. But here we are 14 years later, and no two situations are identical. And he could very well be sitting there saying, well, I'm not going to make the same mistake I made in July 06, but he can make a different but similar outcome mistake in the year 2020. So that's why I say there are certain parallels. And the fact that we are, for our own reasons, and I think they're legitimate reasons, we're exacting and extracting minimum punishment from them for their attempts means that for them, the cost of failure is way, way lower than the potential value of a success. And that kind of a situation is almost automatically one that leads to escalation.
Right, because why shouldn't they keep going? Yeah,
Sure.
I would also imagine that with them being in a weakened state, as you say, they've been weakened by the events of the last month and by various developments in the region. Is there a fear that if they get too weak, they might get desperate, and then that gives them incentive to go on the attack?
I wouldn't put it in absolute terms. Again, I would put it in relative terms. The weaker they get, the more incentive they have. I built that into what I was saying before about the value of success. In other words, okay, the weaker they are, the higher the value success is. And if the cost of failure is minimal, then you just keep trying. Now, what we've done, and again, because we don't want an escalation, is that we've essentially limited the cost of failure to them to whatever they have invested. Okay, I'm using economic terms as the best way to understand this in terms of deterrence. Okay, if they invest 5 guys and we don't kill them, then their total cost is 0. But let's say we kill the 5 guys they sent in. They have calculated a certain value and they lost it. In order to make deterrence really work properly, we should then extract an additional cost that makes them lose beyond their calculation every time they try it. Now, the problem with doing that, and we tried to do it with this last event, the problem with doing that is that if you do it at too low a level, you gain very little from it, and you also run the risk of escalating. So there are all sorts of sort of different value vectors built into this that basically makes us very passive, legitimately, and makes them marginally active, but that marginal can always blow up in everybody's faces.
Wow, so this is a real chess game. I mean, and you've really brought us into the kind of, you know, the management of the tension that everyone's involved in.
Yeah.
So I guess within the Israeli brain trust, there must really be a lot of pushing and pulling about like what the right amount of response is when it comes to these Hezbollah actions.
Right. But again, as long as they have their weapons and munitions in civilian areas, taking out, let's say, a missile storehouse that happens to be in the backyard of a family of, you know, parents and 3 kids, and the house blows up, we've inadvertently created a situation that they will feel honor and reputation bound to respond to, and then it's anybody's guess where that ends.
Oh. All right, I think we should call it a day at this point and resume the story next week. I just want to also add in that for the dedicated viewers who do watch these videos and have been gaining from them, a lot of the people who watch these are part of groups, sometimes church groups, sometimes just local groups in their town of people who are supportive of Israel and concerned about these things. And if any of you who are watching are interested in doing a live Zoom briefing, a talk with Elliot, or something with myself, just be in touch with us. We are we're more than happy to do that. So I know that there are people, for example, we have friends in South Dakota who watch these, and you have a group, and they're part of a group there, the Interfaith Friends of Israel. If you're interested in a briefing, be in touch with us, or the people who are in Texas in your various groups who are there, who are watching us. If you want to have Elliot on, you know, live and get a group together, get a Zoom meeting together, this is what we want to be doing. We want to be spreading more information, more knowledge, more truth at this time. And you know, don't just be satisfied with watching these once a week. Get us more involved, and we're more than happy to share these messages and share this information more widely. So thank you very much for watching again, and please share this, tell people about it, send us your questions and comments. You can email either Elliot Chodoff at gmail.com or pesachwolicki@gmail.com, or just put a comment in the Facebook post or on the YouTube post of the video, and we will respond. We'll be more than happy to respond to those comments and questions. God bless all of you, and thank you for watching. We'll see you again next week on Israel Matters.